My name is Genevieve, and I am a 31-year-old financial risk analyst who spent my entire career calculating probabilities, yet I never factored in the sheer audacity of a monster. Today, as I stand in the freezing rain of this Buckhead cemetery, I am not just burying my father, Franklin Montgomery. I am watching the woman who married him for his legacy dance on his grave. The service hasn't even concluded when my stepmother Marcella steps forward with a smirk that defies the solemnity of the occasion. She doesn't offer a prayer. Instead, she reaches into her designer handbag and pulls out a thick yellow envelope. With a flick of her wrist, she flings the legal documents directly onto my father's casket as it begins its descent. "The lawyers will contact you by sunset, Genevieve," she announces, her voice cutting through the silence like a jagged blade. "This house, the estate, and every cent within it belongs to my daughter Octavia now. You have 12 hours to clear your pathetic belongings out of our sight." Octavia stands behind her, checking her reflection in her phone screen, while the guests gasp in a collective wave of shock. I don't scream. I don't collapse in tears. I simply stare at the yellow envelope resting on the mahogany wood, my mind already running the numbers on the $400,000 I spent to save that very roof. They think they've won. They think I'm broken. They have no idea that I've been waiting for this exact moment of public cruelty to pull the trigger on a trap they didn't even see coming. Welcome to my channel, where the truth always costs more than lies. What would you do if you were evicted from your family home right over your father's casket? Subscribe now and hit the bell to see how I turned their greed into their greatest nightmare. You won't want to miss the final revelation. 5 years ago, the air in our Buckhead mansion began to feel heavy, with a scent that wasn't the usual jasmine from the garden. It was the smell of a slow, calculated invasion. My stepmother, Marcella Montgomery, had been in our lives for less than a year, but she moved through the hallways with the silent precision of a predator reclaiming lost territory. At first, she was the perfect office manager turned grieving widower's solace, always ready with a warm tea for my father, Franklin Montgomery, and a soft word of comfort. But as the months bled into years, those soft words turned into walls, and those teas became a medium for a subtle psychological poison that began to isolate me from the only parent I had left. Marcella's daughter Octavia was the mirror image of her mother's vanity, though she lacked the intellect to hide it. She treated our home like a luxury hotel, but the real trouble didn't arrive until she started dating a man named Vance Sterling. I remember the first evening Octavia brought him to dinner. He was polished, perhaps too polished for a Saturday night in Georgia, wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Vance claimed to be a high-end real estate broker, but his eyes didn't linger on the art or the architecture of our home out of appreciation. Instead, he spent the entire meal asking pointed questions about the property lines, the historical easements, and the current market valuation of the Buckhead estate. "It's a magnificent asset, Franklin," Vance remarked, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. "In this zip code, a lot of this size is worth more than the structure itself. I assume the deed is unencumbered." I felt a chill run down my spine as father nodded, a proud smile on his face, oblivious to the predatory glint in Vance's eyes. When I tried to interject, suggesting that such topics were inappropriate for a family dinner, Marcella's hand clamped down on my wrist under the table. Her grip was cold and firm. She didn't say a word, but her gaze told me exactly where I stood in this new hierarchy. I was a guest in a house that bore my mother's fingerprints on every windowsill. As the weeks progressed, father's office became a fortress. Marcella started handling all his correspondence, claiming his eyesight was failing and he needed rest. Whenever I attempted to discuss the business or the house with him, she was always there, a permanent shadow standing by the mahogany desk. She began whispering that I was too focused on my career in the city, that I was distanced and uncaring about the family's local legacy. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. I watched my father's confidence erode as he began to rely solely on Marcella's distorted version of reality. By the time I realized the depth of the alliance between Marcella Octavia and the ever-present Vance, the locks on the emotional doors of my childhood home had already been changed. I was being edited out of my own life story one whispered lie at a time, while father remained trapped in a bubble of false security that Marcella had meticulously blown for him. 3 years ago, the facade of Montgomery grandeur finally cracked during a rain-slicked Tuesday evening when father requested a private meeting at a secluded diner far from the prying eyes of Buckhead. I had never seen Franklin Montgomery look so fragile. The man who once commanded boardrooms sat huddled over a cup of black coffee, his hands trembling as he pushed a stack of crimson-stamped notices toward me. It was a staggering revelation of financial ruin, a perfect storm of property tax liens, and an impending bank foreclosure that threatened to auction off our family estate to the highest bidder. Marcella's extravagant redecorating projects and Octavia's penchant for high-end European travel had gutted the liquid assets, leaving father with a choice between public humiliation or a miracle. "Please, Genevieve," he whispered, his eyes clouded with a shame that broke my heart. "If Marcella finds out the extent of this failure, she'll leave me with nothing, and the Montgomery name will be a punchline in this city. I just need a bridge, a way to keep the lights on until the next quarter." As a financial analyst, every professional instinct I possessed screamed at me to demand a seat at the table, a formal lien on the property, or a direct transfer of the deed in exchange for the capital. However, looking at the man who had raised me, I allowed my daughterly devotion to override my cold, analytical logic. I agreed to liquidate my entire investment portfolio and sell my downtown loft to provide the $400,000 required to satisfy the state and the bank. It was a gargantuan sum, the entirety of my hard-earned security, but I couldn't bear the thought of my father being tossed into the street by the very woman he adored. To preserve father's pride and shield him from Marcella's inevitable scrutiny, I agreed to a disastrously informal arrangement. We drafted a simple promissory note classifying the entire $400,000 as a private personal loan, rather than a secured investment against the estate. I didn't insist on adding my name to the title or recording a secondary mortgage with the county clerk. In my mind, I was protecting a man's dignity. In reality, I was handing my enemies the shovel they would eventually use to bury me. Throughout the following months, I watched from the sidelines as the Buckhead mansion remained serene, the foreclosure notices vanishing as if they had never existed. Father regained a bit of his stride, but he never spoke of the debt again, treating the transaction like a dark secret we both had to carry to our graves. I convinced myself that my sacrifice was the ultimate act of love, a silent pact that would eventually be honored in his final will. I was so preoccupied with the emotional weight of saving him that I failed to see the legal void I had created. By failing to secure my interest in the property, I had left the door wide open for someone with a colder heart to step in and claim the house I had just finished buying back with my own life savings. The decline began as a series of misplaced keys and forgotten appointments, but within 18 months, the sharp, formidable mind of Franklin Montgomery had dissolved into the foggy labyrinth of advanced dementia. It was a cruel transformation to witness. The man who had built an empire was now struggling to recognize his own reflection in the hallway mirrors of our Buckhead estate. As his cognitive faculties ebbed away, the atmosphere in the house shifted from one of quiet recovery to a predatory surveillance. Marcella took full advantage of father's disorientation, assuming the role of a devoted gatekeeper while she systematically severed his connections to the outside world, starting with me. Whenever I arrived at the front gates, the security detail personally hired and paid by Marcella informed me that father was resting or in the middle of a private session with a new specialist. My calls were diverted to an automated voicemail, and my letters remained unacknowledged. I was being treated like a hostile trespasser in the home I had spent my life savings to protect. However, the true horror of their scheme unfolded in the sterile, dimly lit confines of a private hospital wing during one of Father's most severe episodes of delirium. While I was blocked by a wall of bureaucratic excuses at the reception desk, Marcella and Vance Sterling were busy executing a masterpiece of legal deception in Father's room. Taking advantage of a man who could barely articulate his own name, Marcella guided Father's trembling hand across a series of documents, her voice a soothing, deceptive hum. Vance, ever the opportunist, stood by with a portable notary seal he had acquired through his shady real estate connections. They weren't just signing medical forms. They were executing a quitclaim deed, a document that would effectively transfer the total ownership of the Buckhead mansion from Franklin Montgomery to Octavia, bypassing the estate's natural line of succession entirely. It was a brazen act of forgery under the guise of elder care, a cold-blooded theft carried out while the victim was too confused to understand. He was signing away his daughter's future. Within days of the secret hospital meeting, Vance moved with calculated speed to file the fraudulent paperwork at the Fulton County Clerk's office. He knew that once the deed was recorded, the burden of proof would shift to anyone trying to challenge it, and he gambled on the fact that Father would never regain enough clarity to testify against them. I only discovered the betrayal when I attempted to check the property tax status and found Octavia's name listed as the sole proprietor. The shock was a physical blow. The very roof I had rescued from foreclosure was now legally out of my reach, stolen by a woman who had spent years plotting this silent usurpation. Marcella had successfully transformed my father into a puppet and used his dying hand to lock me out of my own heritage, leaving me standing on the sidewalk of my childhood home, clutching a useless promissory note while they celebrated their victory behind the locked gates of Buckhead. The crushing weight of betrayal might have broken me if I hadn't crossed paths with Bennett Ashford, a sharp-witted probate litigator who viewed the law not just as a set of rules, but as a long-form chess match. When I first sat in his mahogany-lined office, trembling with the urge to immediately file a lawsuit and drag Marcella through the mud, Bennett listened with a stoic calm that grounded my spiraling emotions. I wanted blood. I wanted the house back, and I wanted it that very hour. But Bennett, leaning back in his leather chair, raised a steady hand to silence my frantic plans. He knew that an impulsive legal strike while my father Franklin was still alive and fragile would be a disaster. Not only would the shock potentially kill him, but Marcella would retreat into a defensive shell, destroying evidence before we could secure it. Let them expose themselves first. Genevieve. Bennett advised, his voice a cool tether to reality. Greed has a way of making people feel invincible. Right now, Marcella and Vance believe they have executed the perfect crime because you've remained silent. They are basking in their perceived victory, and that is exactly when they will start making careless mistakes. We aren't going to strike until they are so confident that they hand us the ammunition themselves. Under Bennett's guidance, I transform my grief into a quiet, clinical operation of intelligence gathering. While Marcella was busy playing the role of the grieving wife-to-be and redecorating the master suite she thought she had stolen, we were operating in the shadows of the medical system. Bennett leveraged his connections to obtain a subpoena for the comprehensive neurological records from the week the quitclaim deed was allegedly signed. The evidence we recovered was a goldmine of malpractice and fraud. The attending physician's notes explicitly stated that Father suffered from total cognitive incapacity and acute delirium during the exact 48-hour window that Marcella claimed he had been lucid enough to transfer his assets. Beyond the paperwork, we needed something more visceral, something that proved intent. Bennett suggested a risky move, installing a high-fidelity voice-activated recording device in the small study where Vance and Marcella often retreated to discuss their future investments. For weeks, I listened to hours of mundane chatter until the jackpot finally hit. I captured a crystal-clear conversation where Vance laughed about how easy it had been to guide a brain-dead old man's hand across a piece of paper, while Marcella joked about how they would kick me to the curb the moment the funeral flowers wilted. Every fiber of my being wanted to storm into that house and play the recording for the world to hear, but Bennett kept me disciplined. We spent months meticulously building a fortress of proof, waiting for the one public moment where their arrogance would reach its peak. We were not just looking for a win in a courtroom, we were preparing for a total, irreversible demolition of their lives. By the time the final preparations were in place, I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the architect of their inevitable downfall, holding the detonator to a bomb they didn't even know was under their feet. The silence of the Buckhead cemetery is broken, not by the grieving sobs of a family, but by the sharp metallic click of Marcella's designer handbag as she snaps it shut, satisfied with the yellow envelope she had just cast upon my father's casket. She stands there, a black-veiled vulture looking down at me with a smirk that suggests, I am nothing more than a ghost haunting my own inheritance. The gathered guests, the elite of Atlanta society, shift uncomfortably in the mud, their eyes darting between the grieving daughter and the triumphant widow. Marcella draws herself up, ready to deliver one final crushing blow to my dignity before the first shovel of dirt is even thrown. I believe we're finished here, Genevieve. Marcella sneers, her voice amplified by the hollow acoustics of the burial site. You have no legal standing, no title, and quite frankly, no future in this house. Octavia and Vance have already begun the paperwork to finalize the sale. I suggest you find a motel that fits your meager analyst salary. But before she can turn her back, the heavy crunch of gravel signals the arrival of Bennett Ashford. He isn't alone. Two uniformed officers from the Fulton County Sheriff's Office flank him, their expressions as grim as the gray sky above us. Marcella's smirk falters for a fraction of a second, her hand tightening around Octavia's arm, but she quickly recovers, masking her fear with a mask of indignant rage. She waves a manicured hand toward the officers, shouting about her legal notarized quitclaim deed and demanding that I be removed for trespassing on her daughter's property. Bennett doesn't argue. He doesn't even raise his voice. He simply steps toward the officers, holding a high-fidelity digital recorder in his palm, like a silver bullet. Officers, before you take any action based on fraudulent documents, you might want to hear exactly how that deed was notarized. Bennett says, his voice a calm, lethal contrast to Marcella's screeching. He presses a button and the graveyard is suddenly filled with a sound that turns Marcella's face from an arrogant red to a ghostly, translucent white. It is her own voice, unmistakable and sharp, laughing about how Vance had to hold my father's limp, unconscious hand to guide the pen. The recording captures Vance's cold chuckle as he describes the perfect timing of the stroke and Octavia's spoiled whine about wanting the master bedroom repainted before the funeral was even over. The guests stand frozen, the sheer cruelty and criminality of the conversation echoing off the tombstones. That's a lie that's been doctored, Vance shouts, his polished facade finally shattering as he takes a desperate step back toward the idling limousine. But the officers are faster. They move in with the practiced efficiency of men who have seen enough greed for one lifetime. Marcella tries to pull away her black veil, snagging on a floral wreath as the handcuffs click shut around her wrists. The yellow envelope, the very weapon she thought would destroy me, lies forgotten on the casket, a useless scrap of paper in the face of the truth we had meticulously recorded. As they are led away in front of the very people they tried so hard to impress, the weight of their arrogance finally collapses, leaving nothing but the cold, hard reality of their impending federal indictment for forgery and elder abuse. The legal aftermath unfolded with the cold, sterile efficiency of a financial audit. Marcella and Vance Sterling were denied bail, facing a mountain of evidence that made a plea deal nearly impossible. Their arrest at the cemetery became the lead story in every local news outlet, stripping away the social standing they had sacrificed their souls to achieve. Without her mother's shadow to hide behind, Octavia found herself drowning in a sea of debt. The predatory contracts Vance had convinced her to sign backfired, leaving her personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in botched real estate ventures. She was forced to vacate the Buckhead mansion within 48 hours, not by a stepmother's whim, but by a court-ordered seizure of assets. I stood in the grand foyer of my childhood home one last time, watching the movers carry out the heavy mahogany furniture that had once felt like a prison. The court had officially vacated the fraudulent quitclaim deed and recognized my $400,000 contribution as a secured interest, effectively returning the full title of the estate to me. I had won. The house was mine, the Montgomery name was cleared, and the people who tried to bury me were facing years behind federal bars. Yet as I looked at the spot where Marcella had thrown that yellow envelope, I felt no desire to stay. This house was a monument to my father's decline and my own naive sacrifices. It was a structure built on memories that had been tainted by greed. I made the decision to sell the Buckhead estate within a week of the trial's conclusion. I didn't need the sprawling gardens or the polished marble to validate my existence. Instead, I liquidated the property using the massive influx of capital to launch my own firm, Montgomery Risk Analysis and Recovery. I wanted to build a sanctuary for people who found themselves in the same legal and financial crosshairs I had survived. I traded the ghosts of the past for a sleek modern office in the heart of Atlanta, where the only legacy I carried was my own intellect and the hard-earned wisdom of a survivor. Looking back, the journey taught me a truth that no Ivy League degree or corporate ladder could ever provide. Compassion is a virtue, but kindness without a defense is a dangerous vulnerability. I had almost lost everything because I chose to protect a man's pride rather than my own legal rights. Justice didn't find me by accident. It was a destination I reached through meticulous documentation, strategic silence, and the unwavering belief that truth is the ultimate weapon when wielded with patience. My life is no longer defined by the house I grew up in or the inheritance I was nearly cheated out of. It is defined by the fact that I am the one who stood my ground when the world tried to push me out. Never let the greed of others define the boundaries of your worth or the trajectory of your future. Integrity may be a slow burn, but it is a fire that eventually consumes every lie in its path. I am Genevieve Montgomery, and I am no longer a victim of a story. I am the one writing the ending.